So we just discussed a host of reasons as to why you see the emergence of anti-Filipino sentiment by the late 1920s into the 1930s. And there's some miscellany of reasons here, as we discussed. There's the accusation of labor competition, which was false, as we know, because most Americans didn't work in that particular sector. There's the accusation of being carriers of exotic disease. Of course, that's completely ludicrous. But the main one, and it was actually true, was that Filipinos openly pursued white women, and you see couples of Filipino men and white women out in the public, which aroused the consternation and aroused the ire of especially nativists, because the Filipinos were openly flouting the anti-miscegenation norms and laws, not to mention the laws that were around at the time. So you see violence starting to happen. Between 1929 and 1930, you had at least 30 reported incidents of racial violence perpetrated against Filipinos taking place on the West Coast. Two of them were large-scale riots and fire bombings. And here's one here, the Stockton Record Filipino club bombing. You see the emergence of things like this: Filipinos keep out, right? Here's a sign that says, "Get rid of all Filipinos or we'll burn this town down." Here's a hotel entrance that does not admit Filipinos. It says positively, "No Filipinos allowed." So what about law enforcement? They did very little, in fact, to put a stop to it. In fact, oftentimes, law enforcement were involved. They were the perpetrators of violence against Filipinos. And this would later be memorialized in a particular novel, which we'll discuss soon, by this mono in the West named Carlos Bolosan. But I'll get to that in a second. Okay, now, here, this gives rise to this Watsonville riot in 1930. This is one of the large-scale riots I just referred to. And this is a case where it says here, in January 1930, Watsonville, California, a mob of 500 white men attacked Filipino farm workers after Filipino men danced with white women at a dance. Politicians called for Filipinos to be deported. A law was passed banning marriages between Filipinos and white people, and we'll talk about that in a second. So this happened in Watsonville, California. Here's a headline of Filipino murder, victims of rioters. Another one that says, anti-Filipino feeling flares up in raids. Many islanders taken for rides, told to leave the country in skirmishes Tuesday near here. Taken for ride, what does that mean? Basically, they're forced into a car, they're beat up, and then left on the roadside. And again, this is something that was in the novel by Carlos Bolosan, okay, taken for rides. Now, it was true that not all, but some Filipinos were willing to violate the anti-miscegenation laws, right? So, oh, by the way, here's Carlos Bolosan, the mono, who wrote this novel called America is in the Heart. And this is actually a part of American literature, all right? In fact, personally, I read it in American Lit class, and some of you may have heard of that, perhaps even read it. But it's about the plight and predicament of monos in the West Coast, what they had to deal with, and that cognitive dissonance between, what they were told in their colonial education about America and how it's the land of freedom and democracy, only to come over to America as colonial subjects and to see the opposite. Now, it's important to note, not all white Americans hated Filipinos. In fact, Bolosan writes about this in his book. He had many white friends who were wanting to help the Filipinos. But still, let's remember, this is a high tide of nativism in U.S. history. And therefore, you see this anti-Filipino flare up at this particular time. And he says here, in many ways, it was a crime to be a Filipino in California. I came to know that the public streets were not free to my people. We were stopped each time these vigilant patrolmen saw us driving a car. We were suspect each time we were seen with a white woman, and perhaps it was this narrowing of life into an island, into a filthy segment of American society that had driven Filipinos inward. Please, God, don't change me in America, I said. So you see the change here, right, that's happening to him. He had no idea that America was going to be filthy, right, a filthy segment of American society. But he finds himself in that filthy segment. And again, it talks about the disillusion and disenchantment of many of the monarchs once they arrived here. Now, here's a case where one guy, Salvador Roldan, and his fiancée, her name was Marjorie Rogers, and they intended to marry, but they realized that California has anti-miscegenation laws. So what did they do? Rather than go to a state like New Mexico, where they didn't have anti-miscegenation laws, Salvador and Marjorie decide to contest, to fight the anti-miscegenation laws as unconstitutional. And indeed, it reaches, that is the court case of Roldan versus Los Angeles County, it reaches this California Supreme Court. And the California Supreme Court argues that Roldan is indeed, his argument is indeed valid. Okay, so how does this happen, by the way? How was Roldan able to convince the justices in, again, the California Supreme Court that his argument was indeed a valid one? Well, it came down to what was it's called today scientific racism, right? But back then, there's this science of race happening. And just like any scientific endeavor, you try to understand natural phenomenon in the world, or whether it's, living organisms or chemistry, right? Or molecules, right? Depending on what level. But also scientists were trying to understand race. Now we know that race is a social construction, but nonetheless, scientists were attempting to understand and classify race. And one way they classified race, and this occurred actually earlier, but it still had currency here in the 1920s, 1930s during this court case. And anyway, one way they did it was to classify races according to three types here. And the three types were this: Caucasian, Mongolian, and Negro, or sometimes the term Ethiopian would be used, which is synonymous to Negro. Okay? Mongolian, Ethiopian, Caucasian. And you can imagine what it applied to. Caucasian, we still use that word today, refers to white skin. Negroes, of course, not used today in racial discourse, but that refers to black skin. Mongolians used to refer to persons of Asian descent. Now, Salvador, in his contestation of anti-miscegenation laws, argued this, that California, their anti-miscegenation laws were based on this three classifications: Negroes, Mongolians, and Caucasians. However, Filipinos, it's been ascertained by more recent anthropology back then, back in Salvador Roldan's time, right, that it was proven that Filipinos actually should be classified as Malay, not Mongolian. But California had no recognition of Malay in its anti-miscegenation laws. It just said that Caucasians cannot be in relationship with Negroes and Mongolians. No mention of Malay. Salvador Roldan appealed to the more contemporary theories about race in claiming he's Malay and therefore he's exempt from the anti-miscegenation laws. Now, the Supreme Court, hearing this, agreed. There was no mention of Malay in the anti-miscegenation laws of California. So they did grant Roldan and Marjorie Rogers the permission to marry. So here we see an interesting case where, as I mentioned, Filipinos were, by virtue of their colonial education, were inclined to seek justice. This is what they were taught by their American school teachers, to fight against injustice. So this is what they're doing here. And in case you didn't know, miscegenation laws within various states would be around until the 1960s. And it wouldn't be until the age of civil rights when the Supreme Court of the United States declared these various state anti-miscegenation laws as unconstitutional. So look at that. Before 1967, you could actually get arrested and put in jail if you were having a relationship with a person outside your race. Now, because of the Filipinos' willingness to flout the anti-miscegenation laws in California and other states, well, the label that was created for these Filipino Manongs on the West Coast was, quote-unquote, the third Asiatic invasion. So this brings up the question, who were the first two Asiatic invasions? Okay, the first two were the Chinese and the Japanese. And if you know anything about Asian American history, these two groups preceded the Filipinos on the U.S. West. You had the first Chinese coming over here in the very late 1840s, and they're here primarily in the mining industry during the gold rush. And eventually a law would be passed. It's called the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act here. And this law would basically ban all Chinese labor immigration. It's the first and only immigration law to specifically designate a particular race or national group for exclusion from immigration in the United States. And then after the Chinese Exclusion Act, you'd see the Japanese come to replace them as workers primarily in agribusiness. But you're going to see another law pass, and it's called the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907, and this will ban Japanese labor immigration to the United States. So the Filipinos, as we know, are wards. They are U.S. nationals, so therefore they freely migrate. But still, that doesn't prevent the passage of a law to prevent these wards of the U.S. state from coming over. So in other words, they follow the same plight of the earlier Chinese and Japanese. And the particular law that will ban them is the Tidings-McDuffie Act. And here is it's sort of a compromise here. The Tidings-McDuffie Act stated that the Philippines must end immigration, and labor immigration in particular, the immigration of laborers from the Philippines to the U.S. But in return, the U.S. promises to grant the Philippines independence 10 years hence. So they would promise to give independence in 1944. But in 1944, we were in the middle of a war, World War II. So it couldn't happen in 1944. It would actually happen in 1946. Okay, so just some observations here before we finish Unit 1. We talked about our first foray into imperialism, and it brought us to the Pacific, but it led us to abandon many of our principles, and we started behaving like other empires, if you notice. And what we're going to see in future parts of this lecture, this course, we're going to actually make changes in our foreign policy approach. We're going to abandon formal colonialism and practice it in a more indirect version. And we'll always see how immigration and imperialism are interconnected, historically speaking, in this course.